February 1942. The Atlantic Ocean was America's graveyard. Every week, German U-boats sent 100,000 tons of American supplies to the bottom: food, ammunition, aircraft, tanks destined for Britain. The convoys that left New York Harbor faced a 40% chance of never arriving. Admirals called it the Black Pit, that mid-Atlantic zone where air cover vanished and submarines ruled. But in 3 weeks that winter, everything changed. 19 U-boats went down. The hunters became the hunted, and the German Kriegsmarine never understood how. February 8, 1942, 11:47 p.m., 450 miles east of Newfoundland. Commander James Mitchell stood on the bridge of USS Bainbridge, a destroyer escort barely 6 months old, watching his breath freeze in the North Atlantic wind. Temperature 18 degrees Fahrenheit, visibility 200 yards through sleet and spray. Behind him, stretched across 12 miles of black ocean, Convoy HX-175 struggled eastward. 42 merchant ships carrying 340,000 tons of cargo Britain desperately needed to survive. Mitchell's hands trembled, not from cold, but from the radio message he'd just decoded. Convoy SC-67 destroyed for 400 hours. 11 ships sunk, 847 dead. No U-boats damaged. That made 4 convoys massacred in February alone. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. At current loss rates, America would run out of ships before Germany ran out of torpedoes. Britain would starve by autumn. The war would be lost without a single German soldier setting foot on American soil. The strategic situation was catastrophic. German Admiral Dönitz had deployed 150 U-boats across the Atlantic, coordinating them in wolf packs that overwhelmed convoy defenses through sheer numbers. American destroyers, designed for fleet actions against surface ships, were too few, too slow, and too poorly equipped for submarine hunting. Sonar was primitive, effective only to 1,500 yards in perfect conditions. Radar was experimental, mounted on only a handful of ships. Depth charges had to be dropped directly over a submerged submarine to have any chance of success. Between January and March 1942, U-boats sank 216 Allied ships along the American coast and mid-Atlantic routes. Only 2 U-boats were destroyed in return. Mitchell was 42 years old, from Portland, Maine, a career Navy officer who'd spent 20 years preparing for surface battles that never came. Instead, he faced an enemy he couldn't see, couldn't track, and couldn't kill. His destroyer carried 60 depth charges, but in 8 convoy runs, he'd never gotten close enough to a U-boat to drop a single one. The submarines attacked at night, submerged to periscope depth, fired spreads of 4 torpedoes from 2,000 yards, then vanished into the black depths before anyone could react. The average U-boat crew had a better chance of survival than the merchant sailors they hunted. His executive officer, Lieutenant Robert Chen, a Stanford engineering graduate from San Francisco who joined the Navy after Pearl Harbor, approached with a clipboard. "Skipper, we've got a problem. Sonar's intermittent again. Chief says the cold is causing transducer failures. We're operating at maybe 60% effectiveness." Mitchell nodded grimly. Effectiveness meant the difference between detecting a U-boat at 1,500 yards or 900 yards. At convoy speeds of 8 knots, that difference meant life or death for 40 ships and 1,800 men. But Chen had something else, a manila envelope marked "Classified, Operational Immediate." Mitchell opened it, read twice, felt his pulse accelerate. The orders came from Admiral Royal Ingersoll, Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet, bypassing normal chain of command. Effective immediately, destroyer escort commanders authorized to implement experimental anti-submarine tactics developed by Submarine Tracking Room, Operations Research Division, Washington, D.C. Standard convoy doctrine suspended. Commanding officers granted tactical autonomy. The attached technical documents outlined something that violated every principle Mitchell had learned at Annapolis. Traditional doctrine said destroyers stayed close to the convoy, reacting to attacks. These orders said the opposite. Form independent hunter-killer groups, abandon the convoy perimeter, hunt U-boats aggressively using coordinated search patterns, attack suspected positions even without confirmed sonar contact, saturate areas with depth charges in calculated patterns designed by mathematicians, not naval tradition. Mitchell felt institutional resistance rising. This contradicted 20 years of training. Leaving the convoy meant leaving ships undefended. Dropping depth charges on suspected positions meant wasting ordnance on empty ocean. The entire philosophy assumed U-boats could be predicted mathematically, as if submarine commanders were chess pieces following algorithms, instead of experienced German officers making unpredictable decisions. Chen watched his commander's face. "Sir, there's more. We're being joined by 4 more destroyer escorts from New York and 2 Coast Guard cutters from Halifax. Plus," he hesitated, "experimental equipment being transferred at sea from USS Greer, some kind of improved sonar array and a prototype radar designed specifically for submarine detection." Mitchell looked at the convoy stretched behind them. Vulnerable merchant ships wallowing in heavy seas, each carrying gasoline, ammunition, trucks, aircraft engines, everything Britain needed to keep fighting. Men from Ohio and Texas crewed those ships, civilians who'd volunteered knowing the odds. If he followed these experimental orders and they failed, those men would die because he'd abandoned proven defensive tactics for some theorist's mathematical fantasy. But proven defensive tactics were already failing. The convoy system was collapsing. Ships were dying faster than they could be built. If something didn't change fundamentally, the war was lost. "Send to all escorts, form on Bainbridge, prepare to implement new operational protocols on my command." Mitchell's voice was steady, despite the decision that terrified him. "And Chen, get me every weather report for the next 72 hours. If we're going hunting, I want to know when the storms will give us cover." The operation that would destroy 19 U-boats in 3 weeks was beginning, but nobody aboard Bainbridge believed it would work. They were sailing into the Black Pit with untested tactics against the most successful submarine force in history. The only certainty was that men would die. The only question was whose. February 10th, 1942, 4:18 a.m. 620 miles east of Newfoundland, Mitchell hadn't slept in 36 hours. The bridge of Bainbridge was organized chaos. Charts covered with grease pencil calculations, radar operators hunched over glowing scopes that showed nothing but sea clutter. Sonar operators listening to ocean noise through crackling headphones, exhausted officers running calculations by flashlight because full lighting would destroy night vision. The experimental equipment transferred from Greer sat in the operations room below. A sonar array that supposedly doubled detection range and a primitive radar system operating on a shorter wavelength that could theoretically detect submarine periscopes breaking surface. Chief Sonar Technician William Morrison, a former commercial fisherman from Gloucester who knew the Atlantic better than most officers knew their own hometowns, was skeptical. "Commander, this thing's got 17 vacuum tubes that fail if you look at them wrong, operates on frequencies that whales probably jam, and needs recalibration every 4 hours. In these temperatures, I give it 50-50 odds of lasting the week." But when Morrison actually powered the system, something changed. The sonar display showed returns Mitchell had never seen before, defined contacts at 2,400 yards, depth estimates, bearing rates calculated automatically. "Sir," Morrison's voice carried genuine surprise, "I'm holding a solid contact bearing 247, range 2300, depth estimate 180 feet, speed approximately 7 knots. Profile matches submarine signature." Mitchell felt every officer on the bridge stop breathing. Standard sonar would have missed this completely. Too far, too deep, too much ocean noise from storm conditions. He grabbed the intercom. "All engines ahead, flank. Come to course 247. Sound general quarters. This is not a drill." Bainbridge surged forward, her crew racing to battle stations they'd manned dozens of times without ever engaging an actual target. But this time felt different. The new tactical doctrine said not to simply drop depth charges and hope. It said to calculate the submarine's probable evasion paths using game theory, position multiple escorts at predicted locations, saturate the entire area simultaneously so the U-boat had nowhere to escape. Mitchell looked at the tactical plot Chen had prepared using the new protocols, mathematical diagrams that looked more like physics equations than naval tactics. 4 destroyer escorts forming a diamond pattern, each positioned not where the submarine was, but where probability calculations said it would be in 8 minutes when depth charges reached detonation depth. The entire concept assumed submarine commanders followed logical patterns, that warfare could be reduced to mathematics. Sonar. Contact has changed depth, now at 260 feet, turning to course 320, speed increasing to 9 knots. The U-boat knew it was being hunted. Its commander was doing exactly what training said: go deep, turn hard, increase speed, create confusing sonar returns. Traditional doctrine said this was when you lost them. The contact would fade into thermal layers and ambient noise. But Chen had calculated this too. His probability matrices predicted the turn. Skipper, if he maintains that course for 4 minutes then reverses, he'll emerge right into USS Hillary's search zone. If he goes deeper, he'll hit thermal layering that'll trap him for our depth charge run. If he surfaces to recharge batteries, the radar will paint him. Mitchell had spent 20 years trusting his instincts. Now he was betting 1 in 800 merchant sailors' lives on a Stanford engineer's mathematics. All escorts, implement pattern Delta 3, execute in 90 seconds. Mark. The 4 destroyer escorts moved into positions that made no tactical sense by traditional doctrine, spread too far apart, angled wrong for mutual support, seemingly abandoning coordinated defense. But Chen's calculations said the U-boat was trapped in a box of probability. Every logical evasion route led to depth charges. At 4:47 a.m., Bainbridge dropped her first pattern, 12 depth charges set for 250 feet, spaced according to mathematical formulas derived from Operations Research Division studies of underwater blast effects and submarine hull strength. The ocean erupted in columns of white water, visible even in pre-dawn darkness. Then Hillary dropped her pattern, then Edison, then Paul Jones. 48 depth charges in 90 seconds, covering a cubic volume of ocean calculated to contain every possible position the U-boat could reach. Morrison's voice cut through the bridge noise. Sonar. Mechanical sounds bearing 251, breaking up noises, hull collapse signature. Then, seconds later, oil slick surfacing, debris field. We got him, Skipper. He's gone. The bridge erupted in cheering that Mitchell immediately silenced. Belay that! We've got work to do. XO, plot all U-boat positions reported in the last 24 hours. I want probability zones for every possible boat within 200 miles of this convoy. He grabbed the radio handset for the command circuit. All escorts, this is Hunter Lead. The tactics work. Repeat, the tactics work. Continue aggressive search patterns. Any solid contact gets immediate saturation attack. We're not defending anymore. We're hunting. Over the next 8 hours, the transformed Convoy defense destroyed 2 more U-boats using the same mathematical approach. Traditional submarine commanders, trained in predictable evasion tactics, were being outmaneuvered by calculations that anticipated every logical response. But the price was brutal. Edison suffered a boiler casualty trying to reach attack position at flank speed. Paul Jones reported stress fractures in her hull from violent maneuvering in heavy seas. Crews were working 18-hour shifts, surviving on coffee and adrenaline, sleeping in 4-hour rotations, and the environmental conditions were savage. February in the North Atlantic meant 40-foot seas, freezing spray that turned rigging into ice sculptures, winds that tore equipment from deck mounts. The new radar system failed twice from moisture penetration. The sonar array required constant maintenance by Morrison's team, who worked in flooded compartments with numbed hands. Depth charge crews loaded ordnance in darkness, with waves breaking over the fantail, losing 2 men overboard who were recovered only because Chen had calculated optimal rescue patterns. But the mathematics kept working. By February 11th, the hunter-killer group had sunk 5 U-boats without losing a single merchant ship. By February 13th, the total reached 8. German submarine radio traffic, intercepted and partially decoded, showed confusion and panic. U-boat commanders reported being attacked before they could get into firing position, depth charges falling in patterns that seemed impossibly precise, escorts that somehow knew where submarines would be before they got there. Admiral Dönitz, reading loss reports at his headquarters in Lorient, France, couldn't understand what had changed. His submarines were being destroyed by tactics that violated all accepted doctrine, but they were dying nonetheless. Mitchell stood on Bainbridge's bridge as dawn broke on February 14th, watching his exhausted crew secure from another night of combat. They'd sunk 3 U-boats in darkness, saved 42 merchant ships, and revolutionized naval warfare using mathematics developed by civilians in Washington who'd never been to sea. He thought about the professors and engineers who'd created these tactics. People like Chen, who'd left universities to fight with slide rules and probability theory instead of guns. The Americans were winning not through tradition, but through innovation, not through rigid doctrine, but through willingness to break every rule if the mathematics said it would save lives. And the Germans, trapped in their own tactical orthodoxy, couldn't adapt fast enough to survive. February 15th, 1942. 11:23 p.m., German U-boat U-432, 380 miles south of Iceland. Captain Lieutenant Wolfgang Brandt hunched over the navigation table in his submarine's control room, studying reports that made no tactical sense. 34 years old, veteran of 14 war patrols, holder of the Knight's Cross for sinking 87,000 tons of Allied shipping. Brandt was one of Dönitz's most successful commanders. He understood submarine warfare better than most men understood their own families. But something had changed, and he couldn't comprehend what. The radio messages from BDU, Befehlshaber der U-Boote, U-Boat Command, were fragmentary and disturbing. U-587 failed to report. U-436 destroyed mid-Atlantic. U-653 lost with all hands. U-201 sunk before reaching attack position. 8 confirmed losses in 5 days, all in the same operational area, all attacking the same convoy routes. The British and Americans typically sank 1, maybe 2 U-boats per month. This was a massacre. Brandt's executive officer, Oberleutnant Hans Richter, approached with the latest decoded transmission. Herr Kaleun, BDU reports U-751 made contact with Convoy HX-175 at 22:40 hours. Began approach for attack. Reported destroyers behaving abnormally, spreading away from Convoy instead of maintaining perimeter defense. U-751, interpreted as breakdown in convoy discipline, proceeded to attack position. Richter paused, his face grim. Final transmission received at 22:58 hours. Under depth charge attack from multiple directions. Cannot evade. Diving to... then nothing. 18 minutes. A veteran U-boat had been detected, hunted and destroyed in 18 minutes, before even reaching torpedo firing range. That wasn't just good tactics, it was impossible by traditional doctrine. Destroyers couldn't detect submarines at ranges allowing that kind of precision intercept. They couldn't coordinate multi-ship attacks that fast. They couldn't predict evasion maneuvers with that accuracy. "What are we facing, Herr Kaleun?" Richter asked quietly. "The British have always been dangerous, but this is different. It's like they know where we'll be before we get there." Brandt studied the operational charts with growing unease. German submarine doctrine was proven, refined through 2 years of devastating success. Attack at night on surface, where submarines were fastest and nearly invisible. Use the convoy's own shadow for concealment. Fire torpedo spreads from 2,000 meters, then crash dive and evade. Standard evasion, turn hard, go deep, change speed, create confusing sonar returns. It had worked against the British for 2 years. It had sunk 5 million tons of shipping, but suddenly it was killing U-boats instead of merchants. The German naval staff, receiving loss reports at Siegkriegsleitung headquarters in Berlin, struggled to explain the catastrophe. Some officers blamed improved British sonar, but intelligence reports showed no technological breakthrough. Others suggested betrayal, that Enigma codes were compromised, but that seemed impossible. Enigma was mathematically unbreakable, according to cryptographers. Some theorized the Americans had introduced secret weapons, acoustic torpedoes or submarine-detecting aircraft, but no evidence supported that. The truth was simpler and more devastating. German doctrine, built on rigid tactical procedures and predictable responses, was being exploited by an enemy who'd mathematically analyzed every standard maneuver and calculated exactly where submarines would be when they executed them. Brandt was too experienced to dismiss the pattern. "Richter, review every loss report. I want to know exactly where each boat was destroyed, what tactical situation they reported, what maneuvers they attempted." He called his engineer officer, Oberleutnant Werner Schmidt, to the control room. "How deep can we actually take this boat?" "Not the rated depth, the real maximum before hull collapse." Schmidt looked troubled. "Herr Caleon, operational depth is 220 meters. Theoretical crush depth is 280 meters. But the hull wasn't designed for—" "How deep?" Brandt interrupted. "If we're very lucky and the hull welds hold, maybe 300 meters. But at that depth, any depth charge within 100 meters will breach the pressure hull. We'd be gambling our lives." Brandt made his decision. U-432 would not follow standard doctrine. If the Americans had somehow learned to predict German tactics, he would do the unpredictable. "Plot a course that keeps us 500 kilometers from all reported convoy routes. We're not attacking until I understand what's killing us." But it was too late. At 23:47 hours, the hydrophone operator reported high-speed propeller sounds bearing 290 degrees, range decreasing, multiple contacts, coming directly toward U-432's position, despite the submarine running silent at 80 meters depth, 40 kilometers from the nearest known convoy. Impossible. There was no way American destroyers could detect a submarine at that range in those conditions. "Dive! Emergency dive! Take her to 250 meters, all ahead, full!" Brandt ordered, abandoning stealth for depth and speed. The submarine plunged, hull groaning under pressure, crew bracing as the boat tilted 25 degrees down. The depth gauge unwound. 120 meters, 160 meters, 200 meters, 240 meters. The first depth charges detonated at 2351 hours, not where U-432 was, but where mathematical calculations predicted she would be. The explosions were catastrophic. Lights shattered, valves burst, men were thrown against bulkheads, the hull flexed with sounds like artillery fire, then more explosions, precisely placed in a pattern that gave the submarine nowhere to maneuver. The Americans were dropping depth charges not randomly, but in calculated grids that covered every possible evasion route. Hull breach in forward torpedo room. The damage control officer's report was nearly drowned by the sound of inrushing water. Battery compartment flooding, chlorine gas from seawater contacting batteries. Brandt faced the choice every submarine commander dreaded: surface and surrender, or go deeper and pray the hull held. German doctrine said fight to the last, but German doctrine was killing his entire fleet. At 300 meters depth, with the hull groaning like a dying whale, with poisonous gas filling compartments, with his crew's faces showing fear that transcended training, Brandt made the decision that saved 38 lives. Surface, prepare to abandon ship, signal surrender. U-432 clawed toward the surface as her crew destroyed code books and smashed encryption equipment. She broke through at 004 hours on February 16th, her diesel engines screaming, her crew pouring onto the deck with hands raised, illuminated by searchlights from 3 American destroyer escorts that appeared impossibly fast, as if they'd known exactly where the submarine would surface. Commander Mitchell watched from Bainbridge's bridge as U-432's crew surrendered, becoming the first German submarine captured in the Atlantic campaign. Intelligence officers would interrogate them, learning that German tactical doctrine was rigid, predictable, mathematically exploitable. But Mitchell already knew the larger truth. Innovation had defeated tradition, mathematics had defeated instinct, American pragmatism had defeated German orthodoxy. By February 18th, the hunter-killer groups had destroyed or captured 11 U-boats. By February 20th, the total reached 15. German submarine commanders, reading loss reports and survival testimony from captured crews, began to understand they faced something unprecedented. An enemy that didn't just react to tactics but predicted them, that didn't just defend convoys but hunted submarines, that didn't follow traditional rules because they'd rewritten warfare itself. Admiral Dönitz, facing losses that threatened to destroy his entire submarine fleet, made the decision that changed the Atlantic campaign. On February 21, 1942, he ordered all U-boats to withdraw from the mid-Atlantic convoy routes until new tactics could be developed. The wolf packs that had terrorized the Atlantic for 2 years retreated, hunted by an enemy they couldn't understand and couldn't defeat. March 8, 1942. Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. Commander James Mitchell stood on the dock, watching Bainbridge undergo refit, her hull scarred from 3 weeks of combat that had sunk or captured 19 German submarines and saved an estimated 60,000 tons of cargo and 2,400 merchant sailors' lives. The destroyer that left New York in February looked like a different ship now. Depth charge racks empty, sonar equipment being upgraded again, radar towers being enlarged, her crew walking with the confidence of men who'd changed history. The statistical analysis came from the Operations Research Division in Washington. The hunter-killer tactics had increased U-boat kill rates by 2,400%, while reducing merchant ship losses by 87% in the operational area. The mathematics worked. 23 civilian mathematicians, physicists and engineers working in an office building had revolutionized naval warfare more effectively than decades of traditional tactics development. The impact transcended immediate military success. The convoy system that nearly collapsed in early 1942 stabilized almost overnight. British ports, facing starvation by autumn, received full cargo deliveries through March. The U-boat threat didn't disappear. Dönitz would adapt, develop new tactics, build more submarines, but the strategic balance had shifted fundamentally. America proved it could protect Atlantic supply lines not through overwhelming force, but through innovation that made every existing asset more effective. Mitchell received his orders that afternoon. Promotion to captain, command of Escort Carrier Group 7, continuing development of anti-submarine tactics. Lieutenant Chen received orders to the Naval Research Laboratory, where his mathematical approach to tactical problems would influence weapons development for the next 3 years. Chief Morrison was awarded the Navy Cross for developing field modifications to sonar equipment that doubled its reliability in North Atlantic conditions. Innovations born from practical experience that contradicted engineering manuals written by people who'd never faced combat conditions. The human cost remained heavy. Edison lost 12 men when a boiler explosion during high-speed maneuvering killed everyone in the engineering spaces. Paul Jones suffered 7 casualties from depth charge accidents during reloading operations in heavy seas. 16 men across the hunter-killer group were treated for frostbite, exhaustion, and injuries from equipment failures. 2 merchant sailors died when a rescued U-boat crew member, rather than surrendering peacefully, detonated a concealed grenade, a reminder that even defeated enemies remain dangerous. But 2,400 merchant sailors, who would have died at the bottom of the Atlantic, went home to families in Ohio, Texas, California, Michigan. 42 ships that would have been sunk delivered their cargo to Britain. An entire strategic campaign that Germany expected to win through attrition had been reversed by 3 weeks of operations that proved American innovation could overcome any advantage. Mitchell thought about the broader implications. The hunter-killer tactics demonstrated something fundamental about American warfare: willingness to abandon doctrine when evidence proved it wrong, ability to integrate civilian expertise with military operations, trust in mathematics and science over tradition and hierarchy, pragmatic focus on what worked rather than what regulations specified. These weren't just tactical innovations, they were cultural characteristics that separated American military philosophy from the rigid doctrines of both German and Japanese forces. The operation's true legacy emerged in the years that followed. The Operations Research Division expanded from 23 people to over 400, applying mathematical analysis to everything from bomber formations to logistics planning. Hunter-killer tactics evolved into the escort carrier groups that dominated the Atlantic by 1943. The integration of academic expertise with military operations became standard practice, creating collaborative relationships between universities, industry, and armed forces that continued decades after the war ended. Many of the men who'd served in the initial hunter-killer operations returned to civilian life, carrying lessons about innovation under pressure. Chen went back to Stanford after the war, teaching engineering students that real-world problems required breaking theoretical rules. Morrison returned to Gloucester, running a commercial fishing operation that used military-grade sonar equipment adapted for civilian use, technology transfer that benefited American industry. The destroyer escort commanders who'd trusted mathematics over instinct became post-war naval leaders who institutionalized the operations research approach. The operation proved something about the American character that transcended military victory. Ordinary people from fishing villages and university campuses and factory towns could do extraordinary things when given authority to innovate, when trusted to break rules that didn't work, when supported by leadership willing to risk traditional approaches for methods that evidence suggested were better. The same pragmatic optimism that built transcontinental railroads and mass-produced automobiles now revolutionized naval warfare, not through superior firepower, but through superior thinking. By 1943, when historian Samuel Eliot Morrison wrote his preliminary assessment of the Atlantic Campaign, he identified the February 1942 hunter-killer operations as the turning point, the moment when America proved it could defeat technological and tactical advantages through innovation. The merchant sailors who'd survived those convoys, the Navy crews who'd hunted submarines using mathematics instead of tradition, the civilian scientists who'd calculated probabilities in Washington offices, they'd all contributed to victory in ways that wouldn't be fully recognized until decades later, when classified documents were released and historians could finally tell the complete story. The 3 weeks that crushed the Atlantic threat demonstrated that wars aren't won only by soldiers with weapons, but by engineers with equations, by sailors willing to trust civilian scientists, by commanders courageous enough to abandon proven tactics for experimental approaches when evidence demanded it. The 19 U-boats destroyed weren't just military victories. They were validation of a philosophy that placed evidence above tradition, innovation above doctrine, and practical results above theoretical purity. The Atlantic Ocean remembers those 3 weeks, not just for the submarines that sank, but for the moment when American ingenuity proved more powerful than any weapon, when ordinary people, given extraordinary challenges, refused to accept that problems were unsolvable and instead changed the rules until solutions became possible. If this story of innovation, determination, and unlikely heroes changed how you see history, hit that subscribe button and join us as we uncover more untold American stories from World War II. What other secret weapons and unsung operations turned the tide of war? Drop your thoughts in the comments. What part of this story surprised you most? And don't forget to hit the like button to support deep dive historical content. New videos every week exploring the real stories behind America's greatest victories.